Sarah Boothby and Tony Zervin, both psychologists in Alberta, and we are back on to our shame series. Now, we have one that we already did, but we are going to do them out of order. So this is shame 3 or 4. Nonetheless, shame, trauma, and love.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you get rolling with this one, Tony?
I mean, I think one thing that's kind of worth opening up at the beginning is when people deal with trauma, and I mean, we don't need to get into the weeds of big T, little t trauma, but when people are dealing with trauma, shame is almost always present as part of the picture as well, right? And it can be really kind of a confusing shame because most of the gnarly things that happen between people and within people, we've got our resources to deal with that protect us from them and from other people and how we connect and relate in spaces. Trauma changes the dynamic because suddenly something fundamental about ourselves has been challenged. And it's not just protecting us from other people. When we respond to our trauma, we're actually even protecting ourselves from ourselves. So when shame comes into the picture there, it gets things a little bit more complicated. But if somebody's talking about shame in session or things that really cue shame, that's when I start getting curious and saying, might there be some trauma in the background too?
Yeah.
And I think one of the big ways I see it show up is when we've had something fundamental challenged. The shame can show up in the sense of reality. My perspective of reality just got changed. I used to be able to trust myself. And now because of the trauma, I don't even know if I can trust myself. And if I can't know what it feels like to trust myself anymore, how on earth do I trust other people? So this is how shame can come through trauma, and this is how it can land in relationships even.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And then it's like when I hear you speak, there's so many different directions we can go just right now.
Exactly.
But to catch it, how do we shame? And noticing the different tones and flavors. So I'm curious how you'll view this, but my current belief in this moment is that shame is always rooted in violence. There's always a seed of violence, and then there's different flavors of shame. So when we talk about trauma, we go to the explosive violence, abuses, war, unpredictability, accidents, these sorts of that's trauma. But then there's also the smaller T trauma, which is also rooted in violence. An exploration of what is violence is really eye-opening. But shaming, blaming, neglecting, guilting, humiliating, these are flavors of violence.
Totally.
And they're habitual. So a sarcastic person, I mean, I can be sarcastic at times, and it's habitual. So I was out for dinner with my children. My daughter was having a bit of a difficult time. I was frustrated with her. And there's this couple at the table next to us. And when they left, the man said, "Good evening." And my daughter goes, "What? It's late. It's bedtime." And I'm like, "Yeah, it's bedtime." I was frustrated. I was sarcastic.
Yeah.
And she got more escalated.
Yeah.
And then my husband sort of corrected me, and it was lovely after, we just had this lovely exchange, all of us.
Yeah.
All joking aside, but it's interesting that real small thing for me, uncatched sarcasm, that's violence. And the experience of my daughter was being in an unmet space with her mom.
Yeah.
And that's some fuel for shame.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I'm kind of curious about, this one thing is when you talk about violence,
Hmm.
how do you define violence? Because I want to make sure I'm on the same page with you on that.
Um, well, that's a great question, Tony. And I don't have a Webster's dictionary definition, but I would say there's this cruelty, or it is rooted in shame. It
Okay.
is rooted in my view, self and others in the world around me.
Yeah.
A spiritual definition that I will connect in there is that it is rooted in, oh man, this is so philosophical. We gotta be careful if I introduce this one, but it's uncreation.
Uh-huh.
Violence is against our design. It's against love and loving.
Uh-huh. Okay.
How do you define it?
Well, I mean, as you were talking, and I want to make sure I'm integrating what you're saying too, but even as you were talking, one of the things I thought to myself is, what does violence do? Why do people reach for violence? It's one thing I'm always curious about. And it's interesting because when things come out sideways, these little remarks, these little moments of violence, I often get the impression that it's because they're not allowed to come out through the front door. So they always come out sideways. And what do they look like when they come out the front door? Maybe it's like, hey, there's a bridge in a relationship I feel I don't have. So if I come off the side, then that often looks like violence
Mm-hmm.
because the appropriate bridge, the appropriate door isn't open. So we reach for the next best tool, which is a power move.
Mm-hmm.
But it lands sideways because it comes out sideways.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels rough. That feels like it can be an uncreation because rather than an appropriate meeting, it's power over or a power around.
Yeah.
And shame can get weaponized in that way in a relationship too. It's, I can't tell you, for example, it could be like, I can't tell you how afraid I feel. Maybe because as a man, I got these messages when I was younger, that you're not supposed to be afraid. You're supposed to suck it up, pull yourself
Yeah.
up by your bootstraps. Real men don't. X, Y, Z, all the tropes that come out there. But functionally, if I can't tell you how afraid I am, if I can't even admit to myself how afraid I am, when things happen that make me fearful, I'm going to try to power up.
Yeah.
And if I'm not intentional about it, it can be violent.
Totally. And you think of that small story of me saying to my daughter, yeah, it's bedtime. So I felt frustrated. I'm in a restaurant. I'm an attachment focused psychologist who teaches parenting.
Right?
No, nobody knows that at this restaurant and nobody cares.
Yeah.
And so I'm already frustrated. We're having a little like difficulty settling. All of my background, shark music, parental guilt, beliefs about myself, beliefs
Right.
about the world, beliefs about being met with tenderness and kindness. And here was this, like, I thought about that man saying good evening. He was being sweet.
Yeah.
He was coming from a place of authentic experience of emotion and authentic expression.
Yeah.
And this is hard and we all miss it at times, but I could have authentically expressed with my daughter. I could have slowed down.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes I do and sometimes I don't.
Yep. There's reality, right?
There's reality. There's reality. So then that violence thing,
Uh-huh.
it's confusing, but we all have capacity to be cruel.
Yes.
It's a very human condition. Cruelty is a human condition, and it's always linked to shame.
Yeah. You know what? I mean, given our past conversations, I'd feel very comfortable saying so because,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what we've been working with the shame is that it's a rupture. It comes from recognizing a rupture in a relationship, and violence ruptures.
Violence
Right?
ruptures.
Violence is this, oh, let me recalibrate. Who are you? Like, who am I? What did I do? Why are you doing this? And what did I do? And that evaluation is, that's the experience of shame too.
Right. And and so then if shame is always cruel or cruelty is always shaming, then is uh, violence, cruelty, always unloving? I would say yes.
I'm going to pause in a sense. I'd say most of the time, yes. I'm going to walk it back just a little bit here
Sure.
because, and I'll tell you why. One of the things I've encountered, one of the reasons that kids can really, in my understanding, when kids first really begin consciously experiencing shame is right around the same time they become mobile, right? And it's this experience that if your kid is in your arms, you have a pretty good sense of the range of motion. It's pretty easy to keep them safe, right? And they can really feel the security in that, and they can be reckless in the security of that because dad's got me. 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to knock over the glass bottle on the counter because dad's got me.
Okay.
Dad's also really tired, so that's 9 times out of 10, not 10 out of 10, right? But when kiddo starts crawling and he's across the room, he or she, whoever your kiddo is across the room and they're not in reach. We need a way as parents that see things to stop kids from doing something dangerous. And shame's really good physiologically at stopping.
It's easy.
So it's easy. Okay, yes, right. And it's effective in the moment.
Yeah,
Because
and it's habitual. It's easy, it's effective, it's habitual.
yes.
It's a pattern is created.
So kiddo's about to go do something really dangerous and it scares the crap out of us. And we look at kiddo, we say, stop,
Yeah.
don't do that. And they're like, who's that? Because that's not how dad sounds.
Yeah, dad voice, mom voice.
And it's like, oh, that's kind of scary. And they physiologically kind of fold in and shut down. So that's really useful. And then hopefully we run and connect with kiddo and say, okay, hey, that was scary. Sorry, I raised my voice. I'm glad you didn't hurt yourself. Can I hold you close? Can we kind of reconnect and regulate? Right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of violence in there, but it's also a sense that you're keeping your kiddo safe. But I think you're just saying, let's extrapolate that. It's easy. It's habitual. It's not always appropriate.
And then what I wonder too with your story, because I think there are dangers. Like when my daughter was young, I remember her going through a phase where she would try to turn on the hot water tap.
Yeah.
So there's a place where maybe our authentic emotion, what if expressing fear, don't touch that.
Yeah.
So that could be experienced as shame, but it's an authentic expression. I'm afraid you're touching that.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. It's and that I wouldn't say that is cruel, although it could be experienced as shame and cruelty.
Right. Right. And I think that's also, I mean, think about it. This isn't so much my domain, so you tell me a little bit more here. But when we talk about the different attachment styles
Mm-hmm.
and how kids respond to how they perceive the relationship, and then you bring up a moment like that. If their secure attachment is this moment of, oh crap, what the heck?
Yeah.
And then looking around, okay, mom's here, I'm safe. And I can go to mom.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's like an anxious avoidant, it's, and I'm gone. And mom's scary and I can't trust her to not be scary right now. And now I'm just shutting down even more.
I think too, part of it, when we're talking about trauma, because our roots of ability to deal with trauma and our roots of ability to self-regulate with shame
Yeah.
are grounded in our primary, secondary attachment experiences as children and infants.
Yeah.
Tying it all together. And
absolutely.
So it's noticing, as you and I are, having a dad who says, I'm holding my baby and he is safe in my arms, that he's not going to knock over a glass 9 times out of 10. Parents who can say 9 times out of 10, or like for me being a mom who can be like, yeah, wow, when I let her sit and believing it was bedtime, that was cruel. So there's this message just here and what we're talking about, like what do we do with our people, the people around us, is if I can live with a solid 80% at life, which maybe that's just overestimating. Maybe that's too optimistic. But if we have that, like I'm second best, I'm third place mentality.
Yeah.
Boy, it sure helps us in our relationships. If it's from a place of authenticity, it's not it's not a shaming of me. It's letting myself off the hook. It's speaking to perfectionism.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that ties into, I think, even the reality of the situation, right? This is why I say 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
This is why you say sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. Because there's this recognition that we can screw things up in connection. And that can be separate from our intention. That can be separate from our habit, even to a degree, but that we get it right often enough that we can have a good relationship, right? Yeah. The good old, there was some early attachment research they did about how often can parents screw things up and still have a secure attachment with their kiddo? And I think it was something like within a minute, and they were tracking with really little kiddos, right? But within a minute, the secure attachment parents only screw things up about 20 times a minute, right? So we get it right 66% of the time. That can be enough. I mean, we always shoot higher, but that's like the lower bound.
Well, they say that the research shows especially with individuals who aren't resourced, that there's people who really, really struggle. The goal is getting it right 30% of the time.
Yeah.
And that's what's needed. The other thing is that I just notice is positive intentionality. So what we're talking about right now actually is how how attachment, which is the science of love, which is energy of love that child attaches as the parent bonds, or we sort of attach and bond as peers or with our spouses, we attach bond sort of thing. But those experiences inform shame. Or how our love informs shame, just as our trauma. How does trauma inform our shame? So if I have traumas with my parents, traumas with my main people, my grandparents, my teachers, all that stuff, the big people in my life, my peers, and then things happen as life goes on. How that love stuff, shame stuff, trauma stuff, it's really a huge scoop.
Totally, right? I mean, this is the in and out of like the broad scope of our work. It's like saying, okay, this part of me is not safe with my people. And shame says, hide this part of me to be safe. Right? And trauma says,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
This trauma says, sorry, I got excited.
Yeah, totally, right? So trauma says, I mean, we can, in response to trauma, say, I'm never going to let that happen again. That's going to be a core decision that I'm not going to bring that part of me into relationship again. I would rather die than bring that part of me into core relationship again. And shame can really be part of what maintains that. And touching that shame, holding it even, can be really scary because there is that I would rather die level energy to it.
And I think, I would venture to say, I think I'm right, that it's always a version of, I will never bring that part of me into a relationship again. Different flavors of that, whether it comes across more anxious and moving in, or whether it becomes more avoidant and moving out when our attachment system is activated. Both of those are strategies to never do that thing that caused that pain, that shame, that woundedness in relationships. So the other sort of way we notice this, and it's formed early on, and attachment is not static. Attachment changes. Our relationship with shame changes. Our relationship with trauma changes. if we allow it to, if we have a place for courage and vulnerability.
Yeah.
But this view of self and others is really something that we could look at. And I've said this before, as when I was 4 or 5 years old, what was my view of myself?
Mm-hmm.
What was my view of others? And what was my view of the world around me?
Yeah.
And then we can sort of scoop forward junior high, high school, 20s, before dating, after, all these things to just sort of notice the shifts.
Yeah.
Or around a major traumatic event.
Yeah.
Whether what was traumatic to me, or maybe even when the pandemic started that first week, or the war in Ukraine just kicked up several weeks ago. What is my view? Yeah.
How do I be in connection? How do we be safe with people?
Yeah. And how do I, so then this fits in with this view of self and others.
Yeah.
How do I have a realistic and reasonable view and relationship with myself?
Yeah.
What does that do for shame? That sort of self-compassion, self-love, and.
I mean, as you're talking, I can't help but just think about how much people talk, at least in a lot of my network, about things like imposter syndrome. Mm. And what is imposter syndrome other than shame saying, I shouldn't be here because I'll be found out to be a fraud. I'm not worthy of being here. I'm not equipped. I'm not prepared to be here. I can't fill these shoes. So whether it's suddenly you're the patriarch or the matriarch of your family, of your clan, right? This is stuff I work with clients. Whether you're new into a role, right? Me stepping into this whole profession of psychology, saying, what do I actually have to bring to the plate? Who do I think I am? Grappled with this getting married. It's like, well, how do I know how to be a husband? And then having a baby, how do I know how to be a dad?
You don't.
That's the truth. You know a little bit and you don't know a lot.
Yeah.
And that's even a healthy shame that says, whoa, if I think I know what I'm doing, I can do if I think I know what I'm doing, I can sometimes do some really violent things.
If I think exactly. Whereas if I'm realistic and reasonable to say, you know what, I'm going to help my baby so it doesn't knock over the glass.
Yep.
But sometimes it's just going to happen. And the more we can have that reasonableness of, I think too, children are just really inspiring when we have this conversation. For some reason, a logical reason, probably, it's easier to talk about having compassion or scooping the oops with a child. Yeah. I would say it's harder for me to scoop up my oopses with my husband.
Yeah.
Or friends or peers.
Yeah.
And then it's harder for my sort of friends or peers. If I do scoop it, then it could be hard for the other person to scoop it up.
Yep. So on that, this is something that also sometimes comes up with clients. And it's a defense against scooping. Because for some people, depending on the family you grew up in, depending on the significant relationships you had, the moment you scoop the oops, the moment you try to own the shame, the moment you recognize it, it becomes a weapon in your opposite's arsenal.
Right, and that's the fear of vulnerability.
And that's the fear of vulnerability, exactly.
And that's where there's a need for safety.
Yeah.
But two, it's like the more we have parents who are realistic, reasonable with themselves, that are considering like, what is violence? What is cruel? How do I repair?
Yeah.
So children who have people repair with them are going to be grow up to be adults who are better at repairing. So if a friend comes up and like, I'm sorry that I like cussed you out and then I ignored you for 3 days.
Yeah.
To have a little like 15-year-old be able to be like, you know what, dude, we're cool.
Yep.
Thanks for apologizing.
Yeah, thanks for owning it.
Rather than saying, well, who are you?
Well, I mean, I see this in a lot of relationships with the couples I work with too, is they're coming oftentimes from a previous relationship, maybe a previous marriage, and they're trying to make this new relationship work. But they're coming into this new relationship from an old relationship where clearly something wasn't working.
Yes.
And it's like, how do I step into vulnerability when it was the very spot I was wounded in my last relationship?
Yeah.
And I want this connection. I want this love, but there's this trauma here.
But that's so beautiful and truthful of our unmet attachment needs and our attachment fears, right? Like that fear of I'm never going to bring this part of me to this any relationship again.
Mm-hmm. I'm not like every other way I know how.
Yeah.
But this part I'm keeping in.
Yeah, and then the attachment need that is unmet. It's so fragile. It's so vulnerable. I have a hard time clearly expressing it, and then those times I do, the pain when it's unseen. Because prior to today, there was this, whatever it was, there were all these relationships, starting with my primary caregivers, and then all the other big people, all the other peers, all the other boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever's, dating, marriages. So then here we come to this situation. Everything else informs it.
Yes.
Yeah. So then it's loud. It gets loud in there. It gets loud in there. It gets shamey in there. It gets cruel and violent. My own cruel and violent stuff to me starts happening. And it's way easier for something to come out sideways.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than I really felt like I needed something I didn't get, and I don't quite know how to talk about that.
Yeah. Right. This is a point where one of the people I've trained with, say Dita Marker, what she would say is it's really hard. In fact, I think she says that we can't give up our defenses until we learn to love them. And the way I work with this with clients is when you come in from an old relationship and the same old stupid pattern shows up in this new relationship, I look at it and I say, this is the reality is at one point in your life, this defense you needed. It got you through to you being here now.
Yeah.
It did its work. Here, it's not working so great anymore.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate that it got you here. So if we can appreciate the role it's done, if we can see it for what value it's had for you, then we can start looking at ways where we can find things that fit even better. If all we knew was how to come out the side door, well, let's start talking like we rebuild the front door, how we unlock.
Like those are default strategies. Our defaults are sort of like something happens and I pop into autopilot.
Yeah.
Those autopilot moments, subconscious, automatic movements. It's how we've survived our lives. So even, we talk about surviving our lives and then people say, well, I want to thrive. And some of that shift of space is that in order to thrive, I also need grace to say, I've survived like pretty much the same way, different types of the same strategy, up until I started to awake. Awake to myself and awake to my view of self, others in the world. My attachment story, my traumas, my shame. What is love? How do I give and receive love? What is loving? So I started talking about violence and cruelty and noting in the adult attachment interviewing, it's really powerful. One of the simple disciplines I learned is like some things we just label as unloving. Which then begs what we're talking about as well with shame and vulnerability and all these things about shifting into a thriving place. What is loving? What is loving? How do we offer love? And then too, when we're talking about kids and right, like that thing of there's a moment where I'm afraid and my mom voice is like, come back here. What are you doing? Stop. Because you're going to run onto the road or you're in the risk of harm or you're strangling your sister, whatever. Like, stop. But that is a pure motion of emotion.
Yes.
I'm afraid and I'm in charge of you. So I'm taking charge.
Yeah.
So I would see that as loving and non-violent.
Hmm.
But then
Yeah.
what is loving? Because love and shame
Yeah.
don't go together.
I mean, we've been operationalized in shame, and it's a slippery word, right? I think in some ways um, there might be need to be some more adjectives to really clarify, because I think there's very many different experiences of shame.
Well, the good shame stuff is like, but
The
bad
good
shame. Let's
shame,
just say bad shame.
right? The shame that says, I'm not worthy of connection, I think is the bad shame.
Yeah, the shame that yeah, I'm not worthy of connection, and then I create my own version, my own explanation for that unworthiness.
Yeah,
Yeah,
every weight spiders out from there.
good clarification.
You know, and I was thinking about it because we're talking about three words: shame, trauma, and love.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when we've been through a trauma, one of the most potent ways of healing, of growing after trauma, um, is if somebody can love our shame, love us in our shame after the trauma.
Yeah.
And on a very, 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 very small scale, with the kiddo example, it's shout, shame, run, connect, soothe, soothe, reconnect. It's saying, oh my God, goodness, that was really scary. Hey, I'm so glad you're okay. I'm sorry it was so scary for you. And I'm here with you. And it's okay that you got a little scared there. I was scared too. I'm holding this emotion honestly with you. I'm
Right.
sorry that your experience of me even was something so different and so scary.
Right.
I didn't want to scare you, but I was more scared you were getting hurt.
Yeah.
So I'd rather you be a little bit scared of me and not hurt than really hurt. And I mean, it gets so complex there because in a sense it can be so perceived as violence at times. And I want to be careful with that because I'm not advocating for violence in relationships. No, no. But sometimes actions of love and protection, if we're not, if we can't sit with our shame, they can really look very violent.
Well, and it is confusing. I think it's relevant. It's a surprise relevance that just showed up here. Is how does violence and cruelty fit into all this? But
Yeah,
it
yeah.
does, and I mean, I would wonder if violence is just always emotion or behavior or thoughts coming out sideways, because we can have motion for anger, we can have motion for frustration or fear.
Uh-huh.
Um, we can have motion for shame.
Yes.
You know, like there's a place where, so my son is, he had, well, one day if my kids watch these, they'll be like, you never had my permission. I'll be like, you were so little, I just had full consent. I was in charge. I was in charge of your consent back then. But he's been going through tantrums.
Mhm.
Man, it's hard to know what to do. I have empathy for parents who've had a colicky baby. When I'm sitting with my child who's tantruming, and it's nowhere near what colic experience would be like, but it's bad, and it feels powerless, and I don't know what to do, and I want to get really big,
Mhm.
and just like get you to stop it. It's not going to work. So what's interesting though is holding space to say, hey, you know what, like when you were yelling, that was unkind. After he's chilled out, that's unkind. And it's
Mhm.
important that you fix that with mommy and with auntie and with uncle.
Mhm.
And then holding him accountable to go and say sorry to auntie and uncle, as he said sorry to mommy. I see that as good shame. I see that as non-violent shame.
Yeah.
And you can correct me if you disagree. I'm fine with that.
No, I mean, there's something here that I can't quite put my thumb on, but something came up as you were talking. I mean, we'll probably have to explore this. I want to explore violence with you more at some point because it's, I think, a really important conversation right along and through shame too. But the thing that I'm curious about, some of this came up in my body dynamic training, and really in terms of violence is if we talk about power for a moment, not label it as violence. We can think of not being able to step into power as a place of lack of safety. We can think about not being able to um, not being able to contain our power, not to be able to be with and be with our power in a way that's conscious, as a place where things come out sideways as violence. But then we can also, and I think there's not a lot of good examples of this, but if you can be with your power in a way that feels contained. If we talk about another word for shame, that can actually even be a little bit like the experience of awe. When you're with somebody who's in their power and they're with their power. And I think of this in terms of when you meet somebody who is influential in the field, somebody who's really demonstrated a great prowess in their field, a great scholar, a great author, a great leader, a pastor, a priest, a king, a queen, somebody who is in their power very comfortably and very appropriately. There's a little sense inside that goes, oh, this is awesome, right?
Yeah.
I got to meet my hero and they were awesome. That's a little experience of shame too.
Yeah.
But it's not in response to violence, it's a response to recognizing a very right expression of power.
And recognizing our own little bits of what I'm labeling uncreation, those parts of me that are my attachment wounds, my traumas, my negative beliefs about myself or people.
Where I can't step into my power.
Yeah. And then we talk about power too. So power, and I wonder, so when I'm listening, and I haven't heard anybody say it this way, but there's nothing new under the sun. So this is an original. It's just bringing something in.
Right. Yeah.
Is that with big T trauma, I think the misuse of power is more easily seen.
Yeah.
Whether that's even with an accident.
Yeah.
It's not fair. It's unjust. Why me? Like that. It's very personalized.
I wasn't powerful enough to stop it.
I can do it. And then with like sexual trauma, power, abuse of power, physical, verbal, psychological, gaslighting, war.
Yeah.
Leadership, political leadership, like that's some of our challenge with the view of the world right now with the war in Ukraine, and it really challenges our view of power as the pandemic did.
Yeah.
So those are larger scale. It's easy to see the disruption of power. Me sitting at a table with my daughter, making a sarcastic joke that really wasn't. It's like maybe a 3 out of 10. Like I'd be like, it's a good time. Like it wasn't potent. It's hard to see the little misuses of power.
Yeah, 100%.
But it was a push away. Like to say that is like as a little baby zinger. And so then we have these experiences of these zingers with our parents or our big people, our peers, and they go unrepaired. And then we get into adult life, and we have this bag of trauma and this bag of disrepair and this bag of negative beliefs about ourselves and all of our shame dialogue. And then something happens.
Yeah. And then you're like, what? Why am I responding like this?
Yeah. So what is loving? There's these sort of things of like in a loving space, there's some safety.
Yeah.
There's some risk of vulnerability. There's repair. There's self-forgiveness and forgiving others. And there's some of that realistic and reasonableness that I see what's realistic and reasonable. And then I think what I'm challenging is I also can start to conceptualize what is punitive, what is punishing, what is clearly unjust, what is violent. Like I want my daughter to know that, hey, if mom's saying that, it's probably that wasn't cool. I
Yeah.
agree. It wasn't cool. I agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Yeah. They just
Oh.
loaded a lot of what is love.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah, and then you said something really interesting to me before we got rolling, and it fits with this what is loving and what is unloving thing, because shame is sort of like this. There's different flavors of. There's so many ways you can say this, but one of the ways I conceptualize it is like, what's defective about me? What is it about me that gets my relationship's not working?
Yeah.
But you sort of said this thing of like making this choice, the choice point between what I view as defective or what is potentially destructive, my pain, shame, or my identity, or moving into positive shame or relationship with shame. Like, how do you, I don't know how you would say it. Like, sort of like what maybe even what I might pathologize about myself and or working with my shame.
Man, that feels like a little while ago. I can't actually remember anymore. One of those unconscious things that just like you drop out. Choice point with shame, though, right? I think in therapy, our work is uncovering the shame so that we can make a choice about it.
Right.
Right. And really bringing it up to say, okay, you know what? There, as you were saying just a minute ago, even all these unconscious things we do, all this baggage we bring into adulthood, from past relationships, from parents, from anywhere we have connections, anywhere we felt shame, we bring that baggage with us because we're trying to learn about the world with each interaction. So when we can make conscious choices, we can say, okay, this is the pattern I've had with my shame.
Yeah.
It's present. I see it. And this is the way I normally respond. But now that it's conscious, I actually have some input into the old cycle.
Yeah. I love that answer. You reached the cup.
Okay, great. Yeah.
In that it's like and this is, I don't know where my philosophy of this psychology will land eventually, but it's like we do need eyes to see, ears to hear, mind to know our defective, attachment, wounded, rod, trauma, shame self. We need eyes to see, a mind to know, ears to hear, and then to bring it in. But then there's something beyond that.
Yeah.
That it's we. I think a misconception I'm trying to figure out is I always thought we're going to bring along forever, but we're not. So that's just where my brain is. I'm still like, what does that mean to step into a belief of absolute pure love where there aren't speckles of violence? I know. This is totally up your alley.
Oh. So, but one thing I'll say. This is something that I'm grappling with in my own life, and I'm challenging the individuals that are in relationships and the couples that I work with as well. There's a different way of looking at our relationships, particularly romantic relationships, marriage, that kind of thing. And we get given a very simple picture about them, a Disney picture that says it's all about the love, it's all about the happy times, it's all about the feel goods. And when it doesn't feel good anymore, it's probably your partner's problem. And
wouldn't that be great?
Right, and I'm not trying to make that too simple either, because it's, I mean, there are some partners that are really difficult to live with and maybe impossible to live with. That's true too.
Yeah, there's a place.
Right, but it's the sense that the beauty of attachment is that we are given ongoing opportunities to sort out those little moments of violence into new moments of love.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's hindsight, where it's like, oh shoot, I didn't realize that was how I was going to respond because I don't want to. My intention is love.
Yeah.
My action wasn't. And I see that gap now, and I'm sorry that you're my opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
But that's kind of what commitment is saying, hey, I'm with you even though we hurt each other.
Yeah. And that's those transformative experiences, that's really the emotionally focused goal. Transformative experiences, corrective conversations, beyond being able to identify our conflict cycle and all that and catch it with people. But it's like, ooh, I felt safe in this moment. I reached in a vulnerable way, or you reached to me, and I was with you.
Yeah.
And that does something for our shame, for our experience of violence and what is unloving, in a very loving, true reflection of love science, attachment, bonding, dialogue. The the real summation, a gentle and powerful summation of our goal with emotion focused therapy is what we just call R. Are you there for me?
Yeah.
Are you accessible? Are you responsive? And are you engaged?
Are you? Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's safe. If you and I, Tony, I think that's what's fun about why we keep doing these together is like there's an accessibility with each other, there's a responsiveness, there's an engagedness. I don't have to be perfect. I can share like a gross mom moment. I can interrupt you. I can ask you a crazy question and you can be like, what the heck? I don't know. I don't remember talking about that. But then we have enough safety, even with that. That's a great example.
Yep.
You're like, I kind of know what I don't know, but I have an answer and it's going to work. Like there's this trust thing that then occurs.
I have a thought even. I don't know if an answer is even the full part of it though, right? It's like, I have a thought. There's, in this connection, it's, as an example, it's safe enough to try things out, to think, to make mistakes.
Yeah.
But they're small enough and they're safe enough that it's like, hey, I get to learn.
There's place for, and this is, I've never thought about it this way, but in a secure-ish, and we're friends, like we're good friends, I'd say, on top of being colleagues and stuff. But you think of those initial emotions: fear, shame, sadness, joy, curiosity, anger. So the goal is that in a relationship, in my relationship with Tony, if we're going to look at it as a circle, that we can bring those as close to the center, as close to the well, to the well of our relationship, that we can have shame, fear, anger, joy, curiosity, say sadness. I said it first time, anyhow, but that there's this place, we can sort of grapple. We can put forward, or I feel like the emotion is having motion.
Yep.
Nothing's thwarted in this conversation.
No.
Nothing is safe, but it is safe.
Yeah. This process.
Yeah, I'm not being safe with myself because I have a positive view of myself and you in this space. This is loving.
Exactly. There's as little holding back as is possible in a good relationship.
Yeah.
And learning how to even push the edges of that and saying, hey, how do I get to be more me in this connection?
Yeah. Now, with all this being said, there is less risk than if I was having this conversation with my husband.
Yep.
Or you with your wife. Like there's less risk. We have some risk, but we've kind of hammered it out over however decade or whatever that we've known each other.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's cool to just like zoom out, zoom in.
Yeah.
To be embodied and present.
Totally, right? And I mean, the embodiment is just, hey, the things we talk about, we have to live.
Yeah. We have to, which I think have to is important, and we get to. The word have to is like, we have to. That's why we see attachment in terms of life and death is like, I was designed, I was created to survive based on attaching in a pure love way.
Yeah.
So the urgency as an adult is because it's been there since the womb. It's been there since in utero.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Anything you want to say before we wind things down?
If I had a closing thought, I think kind of just a closing thought would be coming back to the idea of, if we tie together trauma, shame, and love, it's really finding a way and a place for ourselves and with somebody else to be able to love us and our shame and through and after a trauma. Right? I think trying to tie those three together, because trauma happens, shame happens, love is our response.
And to love ourselves as well. Like for me to love you and your shame and trauma and everything that goes about with you. And then for me to be able to do that for myself as well.
Exactly.
And to trust that you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is amazing. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, Tara. This was great.
This is fun.